When I started this LEC community, welcome to another and what promises to be the most exciting episode of Ask an Educator. My name is Edgar Palacios, founder of the Latinx Education Collaborative. We work on increasing representation of Latinx educators in K-12. And along with that, we want to elevate the voices of Latinx educators. And so today, I am thrilled to have one of our friends, one of our members. I would say members. I don't know if you signed up yet or not. But welcome, Devon. How you doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to see you.
It's great to see you. Great to be with you. Let's start with the hard-hitting questions right away.
Yeah.
Tell us about yourself.
That is a thing I should be better at doing. Hi, I'm Devon Teran. I've been here in Kansas City since 2007. Worked in Kansas City, Kansas, as a high school English teacher and as an instructional coach. Went from there to Guadalupe Centers, and next year, or Guadalupe Centers as assistant principal, and then most recently as a high school principal. And next year, I'm proud to announce I'm going to De La Salle as the principal over there, and doing some work with the innovative community that is De La Salle.
I don't think we've ever broken news like that before, so I'm excited that it happened live right here. So congratulations on that new role at De La Salle. That's really exciting.
Yeah, it's going to be a really, really exciting challenge.
What got you into teaching?
Oh, man. There are so many pieces about that. I did not go to school initially thinking of being an educator, but I kind of destined for it. So both my parents were educators. I entered KU thinking of doing journalism, and then entered into an education class because I needed to fill out my number of hours to keep my scholarship at the time. And I enjoyed my education class a lot more than the journalism class. But the other thing I look back just shaped, like as a kid, my dad was a high school principal. My mom was a school psychologist. They had several aunts and uncles that were educators as well.
Yeah.
And they were all on both sides of my family. They were the first in the family to go to college, to receive any degree. And what that meant for our family in terms of lifting us, just out of just low income places that my parents on both sides were, my dad coming from Cuba, my mom coming from Appalachia. What that meant in one generation, and then the power of education, that so many of my aunts and uncles went into education. It was around us.
It's interesting. I think you're one of the first people that I've talked to that come from Cuban ancestry. Like, how did that shape your life? How does that shape your life today?
Yeah, I think about that a lot because that is a huge part of my identity, but it's also so completely shaped by growing up in Wichita, Kansas.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like I remember, so my dad's family ended up in Wichita because there was no work in Miami at the time in the 60s. And there were churches that sponsored families, and there were churches that were sponsoring Cuban families to come and help them find work. And my family ended up in Wichita. But what that meant was that we were not part of a larger community. And so my experience growing up Cuban was very much defined by my immediate family. And it really makes you question and think about the power of what is family in that situation? What do traditions mean?
Right.
And also like the power of getting to redefine traditions, because in many ways, part of what I'm so proud of my grandparents is also what they chose to leave behind. Not just what they held on to, but what they said is like, that's not who we are. And we're going to be this because that's what we want to do.
That's some powerful testimony. Like, I think we actually share Miami in our history. My parents showed up in 1981 from Nicaragua, so they were fleeing civil war at that time. And so, yeah, I think that very much that was instilled in us, like who we are not as a community, who we are not as people, what do we believe in, what kind of values we aspire to. And so I think that's also how they ended up in the United States. Now, they lasted in Miami a little bit longer, I think. Didn't make the terrible decision to go to Spokane, Washington until probably a good 10, 15 years later after they showed up. So we share that. What was growing up in Wichita like?
Midwest, man. It's just, and I'm going to think about Miami just a little bit more because
absolutely, yeah.
I'm curious about this because for my abuelos, like the dream was always to go back there, and I think it was actually probably harder to leave Miami than it was to leave Cuba. And I'm curious if that dynamic was there for your family as well.
You know, when I think about it, it was 1997 when we left, and so I think I was 11 that year. My brother had just he was 2 or 3, and then my mom just lost a baby, and so like part of her decision, she actually just got her PhD in Spanish literature, and so I think part of the deciding factors of her finding, first of all, getting a position and offer as a professor at a university in Spokane, Washington, like. Part of her driving decision was like she probably wanted to run away a little bit about the hardships in life, and so she was probably more comfortable with leaving Miami than my dad was. My dad had his entire network, his family there, and he really he gave my mom the opportunity. I would say like they made a decision. I think I don't know. I haven't. They tell me different stories on both ends, but they made the decision where my mom would continue to study and go to school and like get on that track, and my dad would do labor essentially, and to figure out like how we survived as a family. And so my dad ultimately didn't pursue any of his educational aspirations, and so like that also drove a lot of the decision. My dad has always been like very much I do what I can and I'll do what I want, and so he did what he could at that point in time, and so. He did struggle though. I think after our 3rd year of being in Spokane, my dad wanted to be back in Miami, and my mom was like, "I kind of agree." And so, but at that point in time, we moved to Southeast Missouri. So yeah, it was
right, because at that point, then they're moving for you guys and not themselves, right? And I think that's so. And that leads me to think about like the role of like. So my Wella passed about 2 years ago. And she was for us in the family like the symbolically so much of the culture, right? Like she is and like trying to figure out what that means with her gone. But I think one of the so there are 2 pieces here. So and I'll lead into first. You made a comment. There are different versions of the story,
right.
And one of the things I love to talk about with students and to think about for myself is like how the story has changed for us. Our story of how we got here and what that has meant to be here, how that changes from when we're kids to adults to different phases of life. Because I think about, the classic like Cuban story, leaving, communism is bad, Fidel Castro is evil. We got out because it's about freedom. Right. And then like versions of the story, like as you grow older, like become more nuanced and more complicated. And you realize that all of this other drama that was there, that's a whole other thing to get into. Right.
Right.
But every family has far more nuanced stories going on. And I think that for me was part of the joy of working at Guadalupe, is talking to students and drawing out those stories and building pride in those stories.
Yeah.
And then the thing I think about now, like the defining thing is like, as my abuela has left us and passed on, how every decision she made and every decision she made consistently through life, whether it was leaving Cuba or leaving Miami or the way she raised my dad or us, she always put her kids or grandkids or my dad or her grandkids first. She always made decisions on behalf of others. And I think that is so much of the powerful story. So you asked about what it's like to grow up in Wichita.
Yeah.
Those are things I think about growing up in Wichita.
We have that in common, man. I think like, I appreciate one, like trying to bring up those narratives, right, and try to understand the nuance and like the decisions that our families made in coming into this country, and then like that battle between assimilation, acculturation, trying to, I don't know, depending on who you are and where you're at the time, like, do you want to fit in? Do you not want to fit in? What kind of part of what portions of your culture do you want to keep? What do you want to give away? And so, it's difficult, and I think we're all on our individual journey there. You and I have discussed that a little bit in the past, where like,
a little bit,
just a little bit, around how do we identify, how do we show up, and how do we reclaim some of our identity, particularly in spaces that may not be conducive to that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so you kind of, I would say, fell into education because you enjoyed the class that you were in.
Yeah, I entered it. I always cared about education. I knew that it was going to be a thing that mattered to me, and But at the end of the day, I thought I was going to do journalism, and I liked my education classes more. And I realized, as low as teachers are paid, they're still paid better than journalists straight out of school. So
I'm going to quote that because I think that's a very powerful statement right there. Go ahead.
I could be a journalist or I could eat. And there were grow your own teacher scholarships at the time. But yeah, like I knew that I wanted to be in on that. And for me, I think what drove me to it, also thinking about the high school I grew up in. So I grew up in what was I really grew up in this high school because my dad was principal there before I was a kid there. And then we moved on before I got there as a student. But unique, Wichita North at the time, I think it was my junior year, was the first year that Latinos were the largest group in the school. And that was, I think, at 38%. It was like 36 or 30. So no group in the school was more than half of the student body. Like it was really, really a cool thing that it was truly a socioeconomically diverse place that is it's a rare thing in education to have that kind of diversity. And that shaped so much of my experience. And not just other Latino students, but just other friends who didn't have opportunities to go to college for whatever it might be. Mostly just, families that, they couldn't figure out how to make it work and, didn't necessarily have the good enough grades to get the scholarships. And I was always going to be okay. And so I think I graduated kind of very aware of, while I had shared experiences, I also had the privilege of parents who both had master's degrees, who worked, hard and stayed steady, and were able to sacrifice and make sure that my siblings and I were going to get through college. And ultimately, like, I did scholarships, I did all of that, but I had a safety net that many of my peers didn't. And I think that kind of drove me going into school, that like kind of more of a community aspect of it. I think when I started, it was less about, I happened to like English. I enjoyed the teaching, but really it was, how do we serve this community? How do we serve our neighborhoods? And for me, I ended up moving to the neighborhoods I teach in, taught in, and I've stayed. I live Rosedale, Wyandotte area, love it. And for me, so much of it is, what is the power of a school to empower a larger neighborhood and a community and tied to place?
I'm sitting with that statement. I think that I hear a lot of feedback sometimes when I'm talking to educators about this tension between educators that live within the community versus the educators that don't, and the different experiences that they're able to bring into a classroom because of that. Not that there's a right or wrong. I don't think it's that binary of a decision, and sometimes it's not even an option. But the commitment for you to live in the neighborhoods where your students are and be seen and be present in that space gives you probably a different perspective and a probably much more. Maybe you're more attuned to what's going on in the community, and maybe you react differently because of it.
Maybe I don't know that there's a right. I know it's right for me. I'm going to start by saying I'm not going to be high horse about it.
Right.
At the end of the day, I love this neighborhood. It's nostalgic. It feels like the neighborhood I grew up in, and you know what? That's nostalgia, and I love it. I think I'm definitely tied to it as a homeowner. Like, I'm definitely tied to what's happening, like the other house on the block, and what the association's doing. I think I'm tied in a different way. I know for me, it would be very easy to become numb to my community very quickly if I didn't have myself wrapped up in it. So one of the things, and I talk to teachers I work with about this as well. You've got to find, what is that thing for you that wraps you up in this work, right? Like, because it's so easy to say, well, that's an issue over there, or when you're emotionally overwhelmed, or you feel like you've given everything, to distance from the kids, to distance from maybe other coworkers or from the parents, or it's really easy to other. And I think as an educator, it's really important. It's been important for me to know, what is that thing for me that means that I can't push it away and say, no, that's over there. Like, this is part of me. And for me, that's tied up to just living in the place.
Yeah.
Other people, that's different things. For some people, that's coaching. I think about people that I've worked with, that's maybe coaching the basketball team. But like, whatever that is, you've got to be tied up in it.
Let me ask you a little bit about your foray into leadership, right? So I assume you started as an educator. What was your first role?
My very first role, I did para education. Almost forgot about that. I was a summer school para in Grandview, Missouri for like 6 weeks.
What was that like?
It was fascinating because I was working in a program that served students with autism, and so it was a blended classroom with we had some students who were really high functioning and one student that was very limited verbal skills. I was working with a very experienced teacher at that point, and I learned a lot. Learned a lot.
And then after that, you went into
After that, high school English at Harmon. Yeah.
Did you ever think that you would find yourself in a leadership role, or did you struggle between moving from classroom to administration?
I I didn't necessarily like the idea of going into administration. I thought I wouldn't want to do it. I'd seen my dad do it, and I knew what the commitment was. So yeah, like I very much thought that I was going to go different routes, but the way things kind of developed, I went into instructional coaching, and actually the person who was responsible for coaching me at the time asked me, well, do you want to move towards administration anytime soon? And I said, hell no. And then 2 weeks later, I was talking very seriously to Alta Vista High School about becoming their assistant principal. It's just the way the energy flows.
What was that switch? What was that transition? Like, what made you even consider it?
I can say this now because West Middle School doesn't exist anymore. It's been bulldozed. It's now been merged with, to become Gloria Willis.
Yeah.
But for me, it was getting transferred to a school that my heart wasn't in that place, and I understood why my supervisors were going to transfer me. It made more sense where skills should go and things like that. But it presented itself at the same time that Alta Vista was for the first time hiring an assistant principal, and I had a friend who was there and said, "Why don't you come over and just check it out?" And so I did, and it just became. It just fell in love with it immediately. And Eduardo Mendez, the former principal of that place, current director of student services, is a force to be reckoned with, and an inspiring educator who I think has shaped me in many ways into who I am today.
Appreciate that shout out, and shout out to Eduardo. I know he's working through some stuff at the moment, but I'm glad you're bringing up and holding him in our community. We actually have a comment from one of our viewers, believe it or not. It's actually a comment question, so I'm gonna put it on the screen here. It's from Sebastian. Hey, Sebastian, thanks for joining us. Curious what you think of another common dichotomy: teachers who are from an area, city, region versus teachers who move from other places, like TFA.
My experience with TFA, at least locally, has been excellent. And actually was talking with some of their employees earlier today. My thought is I want good people in the classroom no matter where they come from. Mm-hmm. And what I have been impressed, there are kind of the two big programs in the area, Kansas City Teacher Residency and Teach for America, the two big kind of non-traditional programs, address it from completely different angles, but both really care about this city and this place. So KCTR is doing a lot to recruit people who otherwise might have barriers in the way to getting into education, and really focus on people that are from here. And the local core here at Teach for America does a lot of work of understanding the city and really investing in it. One of the really cool things this last year was they brought a ton of volunteers to come help do kind of the spring cleaning for our school. It was actually, right before students arrived, made a bunch of banners, cleaned up a bunch of stuff, passed out a ton of school supplies to kids, but really they've tried to do some real good of tying their teachers into the community. So I've been really impressed, at least with what that looks like here. Yeah, that's my experience.
And I think that's a really good comment. I mean, educators who are great and effective, like wherever they come from, I think they share some similar qualities, and they know how to invest in the community. They know how to learn about the community. They know how to remain open and understand that there's history prior to them that they can appreciate and delve into and learn more. And so I appreciate your comments to that. And again, you're being very complimentary of some great programs in the city. So we shouting out to KCTR.
Great work happening here, kids. This is an exciting city to live in. Good Lord. We have so many good things happening.
What made you so from Wichita? I mean, look, I love your excitement, and you remind me a little of Jeff Goldblum right now. So, by the way, just want to throw that in there into the space. Is Kansas City? What do you like about Kansas City?
What I love about Kansas City, and first off, it's Kansas City, and what's not to love? But from an education perspective, we have just about every version of school you can imagine, and here with the state line. So we've got two different state systems. We've got large public, we've got large suburban, we've got small suburban, we've got rural about 10 minutes away, we've got small urban, we've got large urban, we've got the old first tier suburbs, we've got the rich Catholic schools, we've got the working class Catholic schools, we've got the really expensive schools in like a Pembroke that's down the street. We have all of these different things. Then we have charters, and we have whether it's a large charter system or small, everything, every kind of arrangement of education that exists in this country that I can think of, like some version of it exists here in Kansas City. And so when it comes to becoming a place where all of these different models exist, it's just a ripe place for innovation to happen, because there's this opportunity for incubation and seeing what it looks like in all of these different systems and completely different cultures for how things are done. Kansas side and Missouri side, completely different. It's amazing how different they are. One has charters, one doesn't. I think about all of those all the time, and I think we're in an exciting landscape right now. Groups like Latin Education Collaborative, other groups. I think about the startups, the Kansas City Startup Foundation here in town. There's so many different groups that are trying to get educators across these systems talking to each other in ways that have not traditionally happened. So that's
So let me ask you a question from a different perspective. So some would say, and I've heard argued in the past, that all these different types of models create like huge systems of inequity for our students, right? And so, so how do you balance that innovation, right? That creativity with the fact that we actually have to educate students and make sure that they are at the top of their game. And maybe, I don't know, not utilize them as experiments, so to speak, or guinea pigs in all the different kind of models that we have. Not my words. I'm just asking questions here.
Really good. But that's truly the challenge. And I think so. It's interesting. So I've been in charter schools now. This will be 5 years in the charter landscape. Before too long, I will have been half of my career in charter and half in traditional public. And at the end of the day, like, I'm traditional public guy. Like, that is my choice for where my kids are, and that landscape. We start Frank Rushton this next fall. I'm really excited to be not just educator, but also like dad with kindergarten.
Yeah.
But I think we get too caught up on choice a lot of the time. And this is a really funny thing to say from a guy that's going to be really trying to build systems of choice for kids. But I think at the end of the day, what people care about more is just quality and making sure that whatever we do really well for kids. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of things that look like innovation, and they are just novelty.
That's a strong comment. No,
there are a lot of things that look like innovation, and they're novelty. And I think that part of the role of leadership in this time is to discern between innovation and novelty.
So from your perspective as a leader in this space, what is an ideal school environment? What kind of school do you hope to create? Or what kind of culture do you hope to create at a school in order to encourage the best kind of learning possible for students?
Yeah. I get a similar question a lot of the time, which is a lot of friends that have kids, same age group, that are starting kindergarten, say, how do you pick a good school? Yeah. And for me, I say, walk into the building and be there long enough they've kind of forgotten you're there, and then listen and listen to the tone of how do staff talk to each other? How do they talk to the kids? How does the principal speak about the teachers? I think that all of this is hinged on relationships and positive relationships, and being in this together. I'm in many ways really influenced by names like Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But the big thing for me and the beauty of Pedagogy of the Oppressed is that I can't do this without you, and you can't do it without me, and we have to define the world together. And that in defining the world, we created and have to start over again. That is to say that I think that everything hinges on relationship, and if we have a mutual relationship of respect and truly knowing each other, then like the rest sorts itself out. Like rigor comes secondary to that, right? And there's a Madeleine L'Engle quote that I read recently, and I think she was saying she was talking to somebody and she said, "Well, I love you," and that person said, "Do you know how to hurt me?" And she said, "No, I don't." They said, "Then you don't actually love me. If you don't know how to hurt me, if you don't know what hurts me as much as what I like, then you don't actually love me." And I'm thinking about that with our kids. Like if we have to not only think about what do they care about, but also as we are learning about social emotional learning, as we're trying to create just systems economically, racially, all these things, we also need to be responsive to the trauma and the social emotional needs of our kids. And part of that is knowing also what hurts them so we don't do those things.
So let's talk about a different R, which is, I would say, reconciliation, right? Because if you're talking about in order to truly love somebody, you also have to know like how they get hurt and how they potentially be hurt. And so when as humans we cause pain to students, to other educators, to other people, like what does reconciliation look like? What does maybe restorative practices look like as a leader?
That is entering with fear and trembling, trying to work it out, right? Like I don't know that anybody totally has a perfect picture of that. And I have now received training in restorative practices or cultural competence in a variety of different ways. And I think every time somebody's tried to present to me a system for it, things start to break down. But when I'm around people that really live it as a way of life, things seem to make more sense. And that's kind of the hard tension. Like I am very comfortable living in gray areas, and many teachers are not. And that is not a slight on other educators. There is a strength in creating like checkmark systems that I don't necessarily have. But I think the biggest thing is probably just entering or living through life knowing that like I'm probably the one that's wrong about things. Like if I'm in an argument with somebody, probably I'm at least a little bit wrong. And whether that's with kids or with teachers or with parents, if there's conflict, I've probably done something. And I think most of us, if we can kind of go through life with that attitude, then we can at least move towards reconciliation.
Do you think that you've been trained in that, or do you think that that's something that's just innate to who you are?
Oh, trained. Yeah. Maybe somewhat innate, but no, I think that and this goes back to Wichita.
Yeah.
I think that like that sort of I'm really blessed that I grew up in a community with my parents and in a church community that when I first started hearing things about restorative justice, like, oh, that's just the stuff we were talking about on Sundays for years when I was a kid. So I'm very fortunate. I grew up in a community that was already the value system.
I'm going to sit with that too, because it makes me think a lot about like just in general. I mean, I'm learning a lot about leadership these days. I'm learning a lot about what leadership in action looks like, and I've struggled and I thought about like how much of your values are innate versus like how much values do you learn, right? And how do you show up as a leader in humility, right? Because I think going into any conversation knowing that you might be wrong like takes a certain amount of humility that we may not all have practiced or like have done. And so I'm thinking about like that struggle around being a leader, being humble, making decisions, doing all these other things, and then knowing that you could all be doing it wrong, you know?
Yeah, but the flip side of that, and here's where I wrestle with it, is like I just generally I undercut myself often, and I think that what is harder for me is to have confidence in my own decisions.
Mm.
So that's maybe the innate part, is that it's really easy to second guess, and sometimes in leadership you have to make the tough call and go with it.
Are there any decisions in your career as a leader that like you second guess yourself and you made a different decision and you wish you hadn't, or it was a learning lesson for you?
Yeah, yeah, and many times it is things that maybe seem small at first, and so they become easy to kind of justify away. Yeah, 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 yes. You're gonna follow.
We're gonna do a round two of this. Just a quick shout out to the community viewers who are watching us. Feel free to comment, ask any questions. I'm happy to put them up on the screen. Obviously, Devon's pretty insightful and pretty philosophical. Is that a word? I don't know. I create things all the time. But anyways, man, no, I really appreciate that sentiment, and I think that's something that kind of reflects your character and reflects your spirit a little bit. And I value that because I think that leads to hopefully great relationship building, and ultimately, I agree with the fact that great relationship building leads to great student outcomes, right? It creates leadership. It creates all these other opportunities for students that you might otherwise have if you're just strictly focused on maybe academics and not the relationship side of it. Not that you can't focus on both at the same time, but it's a so let me ask you a little bit about representation, right? So you talk about your father. Tell us a little bit about your father.
So he came to America, I think a week before his 9th birthday, was sent to live with family. His parents didn't know if they were ever going to see him again. Was here through the Cuban Missile Crisis and had no idea what was going on because he was 9 years old and his family didn't let him know that scary things were happening in the world. Ended up in Wichita. He talks a lot about junior high. He talks also about when he was in elementary school. He thought he got his first nickname. He thought it was pretty cool until he learned enough English to know that Fatso was not a cool nickname. But then grew up. Reality is for my family, as soon as my dad learned English and lost his accent, we were able to blend in. And so for him, yeah, Latino identity was important, but he didn't have. He kind of grew up as a average kid in Midwest and listened to a lot of Bob Dylan and Neil Young and played in bands and did that kind of thing, and then ended up in education. He started in speech pathology, and then sometime around when I was born, moved into administration. So I always knew him as a school administrator. Mm-hmm. But he was a high school principal and assistant superintendent, and then he was a superintendent of Grandview then for 10 years.
Do you think that you would have ended up in education had your parents not influenced that in any shape, way, or form? Like if they were different, they were in different professions, that would that have any bearing on who you are today?
It has to, right? Like it, in some ways it has to, but it's who knows? It's so hard to imagine. Who knows?
No, I think it's really interesting, right? We at LEC think a lot about representation and the importance of it, right? So we know that the data show that when students see themselves reflected in the educators that serve them, they have better educational outcomes, which lead to better life outcomes long term. And so I also think about it's really interesting to me what I'm seeing right now, and I could be completely wrong, is I'm seeing representation in action, right? You saw your father do this.
Yeah.
And here you are, right? Following, not necessarily in his footsteps, but there is a pathway that was built there and that you were able to kind of see and copy, even though you're probably doing things a little bit differently than he did.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fair. That's fair. If he had ended up being a lawyer, I have no idea if I would go into law. I don't know that that's a good fit for either of us. It's just it's hard to imagine. We can get really existential real quick on what, like, do any of us, is this free will, or are we just a bunch of chemicals bouncing around in our brains? I don't know.
I think philosophy is a great art for educators, being able to be in that space consistently.
I think what they did raise me with was values of serving, and so my siblings both ended up in medicine.
Oh, okay.
And that's a different angle of representation, because they were moved largely by cousins who we had that struggled with health issues, and they wanted to serve people and have people not suffer from those same things. So they both ended up in pediatrics, and my sister in pediatric oncology. And I think that was powerful as well. But the thing that was consistent in our family was you give back, you give to your community.
Yeah. I'm gonna ask you a quick, not a quick question, but just a question. But you mentioned about being able to blend in. Can you talk a little bit more about what, one, do you consider that a privilege or not? Two, what does your life look like because of that? And then maybe I'll ask you the third follow-up question after that, so I don't bombard you with questions.
No, it's definitely a privilege. It's certainly a privilege that it's the same privilege that any straight male white Protestant gets in America, that I get to turn off and on my identity when I choose to, right? Like our brothers and sisters that have darker skin don't get that choice, right? And so I think about that, like every label that can be applied to me is one of privilege. And even when I get to claim Latino, like it comes from a place of like, I am asserting it, and it is very much, it is one that's just like, yeah, he's more spicy. I don't know, like it's just, it becomes one of it can easily become novelty. And I do, like, I guess like the one thing I have thought a lot about, and actually, so Malcolm Gladwell, this is maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Did you ever listen to his revisionist history?
I did not know.
He did a really good episode of Sammy Davis Jr. on being the token minority in the Rat Pack. And like that's the one thing I have identified with, is ever so often that idea of tokenism. But I've been real lucky that I get to assert things, and there's one friend that I don't know that he knows that I'm yet. I haven't brought it up because we're just both awkward dudes, and he made a joke about how awkward our handshakes were. They're the most awkward white dude handshakes, and I didn't correct him that hey, actually Latino too. So but that's part of the experience, right? Like there is no monolithic Latino experience or Latinx experience. It's
No, I know you're clearly right, and I think you're also like articulating the struggle, right? Particularly for those who can blend, who can navigate, who can pass. I'm not suggesting that there's tension there, but there is some sort of conflict of like that light switch you're talking about, turning it on, turning it off, and when you do it, when you don't do it, how do you do it, why do you do it, and then like how do you reclaim these different points of intersectionality for yourself, right?
Yeah.
And to your, I mean, that awkward situation of like the handshake, and you've like,
I'm not gonna let you know right now.
But my question to that would be, right, like, and you don't have to answer this, but my initial question to that is like, why wouldn't you, right? Which I know is layered in like history and all these other things that come along with that. But before we get to that, a quick break. Hurston, who's also watching with us, says, I have a documentary that I'll be shooting to explore this deeper. Blending is a cross-cultural phenomenon. Thanks, Hurston, for that comment.
Yeah, I will be interested to see that documentary.
Let me ask you about that. So how does that experience actually shape your view and your work around equity, and talking about privilege and
yeah, it means that I need to. I view kind of my role in this as elevating the voices of others, because for me, I've just received so many blessings that like what I need to do is to level playing field and elevate voices of others, and that's where I'm more comfortable anyways. Like I don't necessarily want to be the center of the show like I am right now. This is not number one, but I think about that. I think it's also perspective taking. Like I have to make sure to be really careful about perspective because while there's certain shared experiences, not all are. And I one of the things I talk about with teachers is being really careful about painting students with a wide brush.
Mm,
And yeah, they're shared experiences, and those matter. And there are many things that are common, and we need to talk about, and we can celebrate. And some of them are things that need to change, and some of them are like all sorts of things. But painting with a wide brush, I think, is one of the dangers we really fall into in education, because it's so easy to look at a classroom where it's mostly Latino or mostly African American kids, and to assume all of these shared experiences between them that don't
right.
actually exist.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a really good point. I mean, and it's a great point, and you really like solidify that with saying like we are not a monolithic community. Like we show up in all different shades, sizes, types, and whatnot. It's a matter part if you go to the REI training that Stephanie and Rodney do, like you learn about like the racialization of the Hispanic community and what that means, and you learn about these things right from a very different perspective. But I will also say, like, as a Latino community in this country, we represent 32, 33 different Latin American countries, right? We come with all these different experiences, conservative, liberal, very different perspective, privilege, not privilege, socioeconomic status and whatnot. And so it is a danger to paint us all with the same brush. And I agree, from a representation perspective, I think it's important to have educators in the classroom that understand that there's nuance, back to that word again, right? That there's nuance in our community, and that we have to be culturally responsive and thoughtful about how we approach different sets of communities. Just quickly, I'm gonna bring into this space our good friend Lori. Comments: I've been asked if I was Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, mixed, everything but Mexican. However, I don't correct most of the time. And then she adds, yes, it does go with layers of being rejected by Latinos in the past and even family. So it's just easy to answer no and move on. Those are really real sentiments. I mean,
yeah.
I tell the story, not to take over your time, because I know you are the star of the show. But I think about this in Miami, like when I was born there and I grew up through sixth grade there, like I knew I was from Nicaragua. I know my parents from Nicaraguense, right? Like I wasn't from Nicaragua technically, but Nicaraguense by heritage and whatnot. And then somehow I became Mexican in Spokane, Washington, right? And that was the identity that was assigned to me. And then, I became other identities because people were just incredibly rude and hurtful. And then, so I kind of tended to adopt that Mexican identity for a little bit, which was weird because one, I'm not. And then two, like, but I definitely, I thought I understood the culture. I thought that was like the culture that I most understood. But then talk about distancing and other couple of things. So it's easier to be like, no, I'm not Mexican, and then walk away and not really address all these other issues around identity. So I share that with you. And that rejection in our community, Francisco Guajardo, who we had at a conference last year, he really talked about this idea of Nepantla, the concept of like we're the in-between, right? So we don't necessarily belong here, we don't necessarily belong there, and that creates a lot of tension within ourselves and within our identities. But it's something that I think we all share in common for the most part. So it's a really interesting kind of point of unification, but also diversification.
Let me go English teacher for just a second here.
Go for it.
I'm going to give a shout out to Unidos US, formerly NCLR, for those who know that. I'm also a NISL fellow, which is their fellowship for Latino school leaders. And the last trip I took early in March, we had a good conversation actually with some of the fellows, like, why do we take each other's cards? Why do we take each other's Latino cards away from each other? We have so many rich experiences, and it's making me think of the poem "I Am Joaquin," which for all of our viewers here, if you haven't read "I Am Joaquin," stop watching right now and go read "I Am Joaquin" in its entirety. It is one of the first poems that like really just gripped me by the heart as a kid. But the lines of I am Aztec prince and Christian Christ, that I am the oppressor and I have been the oppressed, that like this idea that I am the Spanish, I am the Indian, I am the Texan, I am the Mexican, all this stuff. And, you know, my family's heritage is not Chicano. I can't claim that, but like that blending and the tension of all of these things mixed up. I think the first line is I live in a world of confusion, or a land of confusion. Just an incredible poem that hits that zeitgeist in a way that I've never seen anything else quite.
And just to, I pulled it up just so we have it on, and I put the link in the comments. That first two lines: Yo soy Joaquín perdido en un mundo de confusión. I am Joaquin lost in a world of confusion. And that's, it doesn't clearly articulate the Latinx, Latino, Hispanic experience. What does, right? I don't know.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's amazing.
Yeah. Let me pull in another comment. Hurston is interested in this topic. Thanks for joining us, man. Many blur the line between culture, perceived ethnicity, and identity in general. These terms are all different. I think this is where many D&I efforts and corporations are getting it wrong. And yeah, absolutely, because like the more that we create affinity groups, which I'm a big believer in, but in the majority, for the folks who are in the majority, like it's easy to say like, oh, here are all your Latinos. Like, we're just going to give tacos and like call it a day. Right. Like that is an easy way of dealing with that and pushing people to the side, rather than being really intentional about learning about the different nuances within the community and how to best serve all versus just a few. But, you know, I think I struggle with like, we had a great comment from Lalo Moreno a couple of weeks ago, which he said, when they said, I should say, sometimes we need spaces to be and not spaces to teach, right? Like we just need spaces where we can be who we are and not have to worry about telling others about who we are and why we are and all these other things, that they're just kind of understood. So anyways, but thanks for sharing that poem, man. That's a fantastic, it's a reminder of our, of the struggle of identity for our community and how we navigate this world.
Oh yeah. I'll give another shout out. I'm just going to be shout out guy today. I don't know if she pays attention to these, but Marta Caminero Santangelo, professor at KU, University of Kansas, I had her for a U.S. Latino Lit class. And I think that in many ways, that was probably the first, that was like a baptism of the mind in some ways of waking up to just labels, identities, I like in so many ways, like things I did not have terms for before. And I don't think we read I Am Joaquin in there, but many other pieces in that space gave me kind of the first framework to start to wrap this around in ways that, like, I think that had I not had those courses, I think if I had not had the experience of working in Guadalupe, that like my own personal identity and what being a Latino educator, father, community member in Kansas City, like all of those things would probably be really different if I had not had those experiences.
It's so important for us to be grounded in our history and where we come from, and to understand the nuance is the word that keeps coming to mind, but really like as our community, how we contributed. You know, I think about the case, I lost the name, but the case before Brown versus Board of Education, which
by the way, no, it's right. I'm actually doing some writing on that right now for my Unidos work. That is Sylvia Mendez versus which, by the way, this month is the anniversary.
Shout out to the
April 14th, 1947. It was the first case in U.S. court. It was the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the first case that successfully argued that that segregation was unconstitutional.
Can you repeat that again for others?
It was the first case. So on April 14th, 1947, the United States Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled on what would be the first. I'm just reading because I have this up on the other screen because I'm writing about this for my Unidos. But it was the first case that argued that segregation is illegal and unconstitutional because separate cannot be equal. Other cases had attempted up to that point to argue that things were not equal and thus should be integrated. But it was the first that said that segregation itself is not equal. And Thurgood Marshall, who went on to argue in Brown versus Board, was involved in helping to craft some of the arguments of that case. It's incredible. The players who were involved in that case, what they ended up going on to do and how it shapes it today. But had that case not happened, I don't know that Brown would have come out the same way. We could have had a very different understanding of what the role of civil rights in education is today.
Yeah, and it's a definitely a precedent-setting case that Brown was able to build on top of and have that outcome. And I think to really mixed reviews at this point, right? I think that there's a lot of other questions on the other side of that as well.
Well, so I'm going to go into my blog post for Unidos, which I'm still rough drafting. But here's another reason to listen to Malcolm Gladwell, but also a number of other people. He did another episode on Brown v. Board. And here's where kind of my passion project on stuff I'm working on outside is coming into the classroom and into the school. We have put the burden of desegregation on kids. As a country, we've been doing that for the last 50 some years. What we should have done is,
it's specifically Black and brown kids.
Oh yeah. We put that work on students. That work should have been done by adults.
Right.
We tried to integrate students. We should have integrated adults. And so the power of representation today and the power of what the Department of Ed should be looking at and collecting data on so that we even know, because right now we're not collecting the data. We ought to be looking at what are the recruitment and retention rates for Black and brown educators. You've shared with me the story about there are 200 some districts in New York that don't have a single educator of color.
That's correct.
State that has the highest representation in the country, if they have the highest representation in the country, and they've got 200 districts without anybody, imagine what it's like out here. And the problem is we don't know. We don't have good data because unless some university professor decides to work on this for their doctoral research or a state gets really interested in it, we don't report this data to the Department of Education or the Department of Labor Statistics. We don't know. Yeah.
I will point out that though in New York, and then I'm going to do a hard pivot because I would be remiss if we didn't bring up COVID-19 and what you're working through on that. But New York City Department of Education, the chancellor is Richard Carranza, who happens to be Latino and an exceptional speaker and thought leader and has a lot of fans in that community, as I'm sure some opposition because, you can't be in leadership and not see both. But a really powerful and cool individual that I think models representation and knows how to build community in through that perspective. So I appreciate this conversation. I put some links up on Mendez versus Westminster versus State of California. And then of course, I am Joaquin. So those resources are in the comments. How are COVID-19, man? What's going on?
Well, what's going on right now, and this is very COVID, is something just happened upstairs, and now my youngest daughter is crying because both of my kids are home with me right now, and I gave them Sesame Street, but it's very likely that it stopped streaming, and now they're doing something to make each other mad.
Feel free to.
That just happened. No, I think we're okay. The crying is not that. That sounds like an argument, not like somebody is hurt. They are two very different sounds.
I trust your judgment as a father and as an educator to make that determination. So luckily, you are both. I think two things that I've been asking a lot of folks, like one, what's your biggest concern from COVID in terms of education? And then two, what's the biggest opportunity that you see?
Biggest concern is that Latinos as a group are the least likely to have broadband internet or technology at home. And our students are falling behind. That just the biggest concern is that while smartphone use is very similar to other demographic groups, significant lag on computers and what that means, and also just the rates of internet use. And that definitely jumps by generation. So also look at parents. It's you start to dig into those numbers. There's some really good market research out there on that. Like what our generation of parents, like their computer literacy compared to other ethnic groups, like their computer literacy, it's just significantly lower. And so their ability to help their kids with all of the digital work that is going out is a major challenge. The other challenge is I think about this right now, and I was talking to our counselor that they're still trying to follow up with many students that are kind of flagged as high risk, and just follow up is really hard because so many of our kids are working with their parents and doing those night shifts, cleaning things, and again, not trying to create a monolithic group. This is just what's true of the students that we serve right around here. But many are finding ways to work with their families, and the focus on their education is secondary, especially when there are bills to pay and people are hurting right now. So that is very real. And my perspective on that is very much the high school perspective. And I know that many high school kids are taking care of younger siblings. Like all of that is just the reality of it right now. The opportunity that is tied up in this. We will all be making a major mistake if every school doesn't go back and really question what is it that matters most to us. And that might be that we get rid of things that we don't need. It might be that we double down on things that we thought we didn't. It might be that we move towards more digital education because we learned how to do it, or it might just reaffirm that we really like holding books in our hands. And I think that needs to be there again, like that's not monolithic either. That is really determined by the community that you serve in the school that you work in and what is right for that place.
I appreciate that. You know, to your point about like not every solution is the right solution. And I think that solutions have to be raised by the community members themselves versus like we have ideas for them and then we implement on their behalf. So I appreciate those two perspectives on there. Actually, you're one of many educators that are struggling right now with contacting, I guess what I would call missing, unquote, families and students. That gives me some ideas on how we can help support as an organization as well, like maybe bringing everybody together to see what's working and what's not working. So that might be something I ask you to kind of participate in moving forward. And we, believe it or not, it is 4:58. So we roughly have 2 minutes left on this. Thanks for all those that stuck with us and those that will join us in the future as well. So I always end this conversation. Typically, I hand it off to Susanna, who's an educator, and like I love giving educators the last word and the last questions. But my question for you is like, so as a community, how can we help support you?
Oh, wow. I haven't thought about that. As a community, I think that I might have to, I think that for me, when we come together as a community, whether it's small events like dinners that we've had or the larger conference with Evolucion that we hosted, being able to build connections and to just encourage each other is maybe the most important thing. I really enjoy seeing good work that other people are doing and feeling like we're building connections and relationships with others in the community. So that's what I need. And so that's really hard to do right now with COVID.
Well, part of this effort in having conversations with Latinx educators is one, to elevate the voices of Latinx educators, and two, to help build that community, because hopefully people will engage with you after the fact. There might be some thoughts and ideas that you'll be able to share that they'll pick on, and we'll be able to connect you all. So with that,
please, whoever, look me up on LinkedIn. Let's be connections. I would love to talk about big ideas and learn what you're doing that's working.
If you are on Facebook, Devon, there is a question that Hurston asked that I'm not going to pose up here, but I think you might have an answer for him. So you might check that out on the Facebook page. For everybody else, thank you so much for joining us today. Devon, it was a pleasure talking to you. Congratulations and good luck on your next role at De La Salle. It's going to be fun.
It is. It's going to be real good.
All right. LEC community, thank you so much for your time. I'll talk to you soon.